cap off the reflections of the last two recordings, I want to mention that Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, is one of the most widespread and all-pervasive presences in not just philosophy, but in the general intellectual scene in on the planet. And as evidence of that, I will mention that so far as I know, there is no other living intellectual, scholar, philosopher, cultural theorist, what else, who has their own academic peer-reviewed journal. Usually this is reserved to the dead. I would say his view on the issue of, in pragmatic terms, as it were, in, I shouldn't say, pragmatic terms, let's say, as a course of action. His view is that one can take the rationality of the principle of equality and say the Apollonian view in the terms of, so far as I understand, Dugin, the Apollonian view, which Zizek assigns to Habermas. He says Habermas is the de facto voice of the standard view, announces that we do uphold the universal human rights and the equality under the law, and that therefore when one sees the de facto variance from this, I'll just mention in passing that I saw a video, by the way, of the recent never mind. Let's go on with this. So he just says you should simply appeal to those principles, whether or not you regard them as being hypocritical and out and out. That out and out oppression is what's really happening, but the principles say something totally different, but therefore then just appeal to the principles because they have a certain power anyway. But this is just, as it were, on the level of a plan of action, and it's not at the level of a principle, or neither does it give any, in Nietzsche's, in the sense that Strauss assigns to Nietzsche of the long run. It doesn't tell you anything in the long run about the cosmology of the world, as it were, that would support such doing. It just says, here's a prescription for the short run. So let's, in Zizek style, let's go to Philip K. Dick. So I've been looking at this, and I want to try to superimpose a Philip K. Dick example over what one of Nietzsche's most famous statements from the Youth and Abuse of History. I've been looking at the Man in the High Tower, the HBO series, the first couple episodes recently, and there's this sense in the plot is about there's a kind of there's the absence of the real history of the Americans winning the war. Instead, there's a kind of this regime which is guarding over this absence, which is the regime whereby the Nazis and the Japanese won the war. Or to put another way, there's the reality is fragile in some sense. One scene in the and this has something to do with the forgetfulness, the animal, and so Nietzsche's praising the forgetfulness in the animal. I think of Judith Butler is fond of quoting Walter Benjamin to say, "I rather prefer remembrance." But Nietzsche is advising us to use this possibility of the animal, which Heidegger is telling us in Nietzsche's understanding of history is the primary thing. The animal is the forgetfulness, and the forgetfulness is what gives life its vigor. And in the show, there's a very nice piece of Philip K. Dick dialogue. He's has a wonderful power to bring out very mundane discussions in a way that's suggestive, that somehow mark something totally different. There's a scene where there's some, and to do it with some grace and nuance, there's a scene where some ashes are in the air, and somebody says, "What's that?" And the guy says, "Oh, they're burning the chronically ill." And he adds, "Drag on the state, you know." And then there's kind of a beat goes by. Maybe there's some other dialogue. And then the guy says, "You know, I can hardly remember why we even fought this war." So there's a question of the forgetfulness here. Let me go over and superimpose this immediately over something which is... So I want to claim that I see in this very famous passage of Nietzsche a kind of forgetfulness of something that we have that we don't see where Nietzsche was speaking from in right after the Franco-Prussian War in 1874, what the world was like then. So Nietzsche says, "If the doctrines of sovereign becoming, of the lack of any cardinal difference between man and beast, doctrines that I regard as true but deadly, if these doctrines will be broadcast among the people for more than one generation with a fanaticism of conversion which is now customary, then one ought not to be surprised that the people perishes of petty egoism, of ossification and greed, falls apart and ceases to be a people. In its place, systems of individual egotism by fraternities for the exploitation of the non-brothers, or one could say of secret societies for the exploitation of the non-members, and similar forms of utilitarian vulgarity." He goes on to speak of history from the standpoint of the masses, and he makes some comments which I want to question here, whether these are usually interpreted under the larger notion of Nietzsche's aristocratic bearing. Carl Jung, by the way, speaks all the time of nature being aristocratic, meaning what we're born with as our characteristics or products of our birth of nature, and therefore nature apportions its gifts differently. And so you can think about that. Is reason actually, is reason so opposed to birth or nature that it must, as it were, contradict it to the roots, to the deepest roots of the gifts of human beings and their native genius? He goes on to speak of the masses seem to be worth notice in three aspects only. First, as the copies of great men printed on bad paper from worn-out plates. Next, as a contrast to the great men. And lastly, as their tools. For the rest, let the devil and statistics fly away with them. So actually, I wonder if this comment, so acerbic and cutting, might be interpreted as made out of the what he just said before that, out of the... In other words, in this atmosphere which we're coming into, where the egotism, which I would gloss very simply as capitalism, which has its greatest representative more perhaps in Locke than in Adam Smith. But Adam Smith speaks of the perfect liberty in regard to the ability of every citizen to contract for their employment and so on, which then comes into all kinds of problems because of the inequality of the position by which the contracts. The rich man is in a better position to bargain than the poor man. But I think Locke brings out more of this, and therefore we go into what Nietzsche is talking about in some sense is the liberal order, in the sense that the American founding and the French Revolution, the American founding has less appeal to thick doctrine than does the French Revolution. But the basic gist of it is the state is there in the sense of this night watchman state because for instance, Thomas Paine says famously that the state is a necessary evil, so merely a necessary evil, which isn't to say the state should be destroyed. The state is necessary, but it's also an evil. Where's supposed to be the good? The good is supposed to be society in contrast to the state. So everything interesting, Strauss says everything interesting happens in society rather than in the state, which is just there to make up the edges, as it were, and keep its so quote unquote monopoly on violence, as Weber puts it, to keep order. But if you think of it in this way, all the railing that Nietzsche makes about the egotism is the result of the beginning of the zone of society where everybody claims we have my right to do whatever I want, and I'm in contest with everyone else in society. So instead of being the undifferentiated entity of the country, you have the state on the one side and society where everybody is in a contest, the egotistical contest where then arise the secret societies that for the exploitation of the non-members and the other acts of utilitarian vulgarity. We do not see this. We've forgotten, in some sense, as it were. It's as though we were saying, we don't know what it was all about. What was Nietzsche railing about? I don't get it. So it's like the guy in the man in the high tower saying, I don't understand. Why did we bother fighting the Nazis? So there's something, I think, to reflect on in that. Let's just try to continue and go back more into the Heideggerian sense of it on the next recording.